Okay, let's continue with Who's to Blame for House Rules. If you've clicked on this video without watching the part 1, I recommend you go back and just watch part 1 first. If you're from part 1, thanks, welcome again, and let's continue.
Free parking, right? The easiest rules in Monopoly. You land on free parking, you just sit there, you do nothing. Is it that simple though? In 1936, a year after Parker Brothers bought the rights to Monopoly, they introduced an add-on, and that was the option to buy stock. It was another square that you could place over free parking, and once you landed there, you have the ability to buy and sell stock. What you see here actually is a later version of that add-on. It was reintroduced at a later date, somewhere in the 1990s. Moving forward to 1990, Parker Brothers introduced Junior Monopoly to attract younger players. This did not have free parking. In its place was an icon of Uncle Pennybags. There are two squares within the game that represent shows. If you land on the show, you pay $2 and give that to Uncle Pennybags. If you or your opponent lands on Uncle Pennybags, you can take any money that was given to him from the proceeds of the shows. Once again, this is another use of free parking. In 2002, Parker Brothers introduced the American version of Monopoly. This had alternative rules for the four corners, referred to as the American Challenge. If you landed on free parking, you could pick a card from the American Challenge and answer a question. If you answered the question right, you could move to any unowned property on the first side of the board. The city version of Monopoly was introduced in 2009. Once again, this had an alternative use for free parking. If you had a card which was referred to as a Dodge card, it meant that you were able to skip rent. But once you use that card, it gets placed back on the free parking square for the next person. So when the next person lands on free parking, they can pick up the Dodge card and use that card at any time to get out of paying rent. Some of you may be familiar with the Empire version of Monopoly that was introduced in 2017. Once again, if you landed on free parking, you had an alternative. You could pay, I believe it's 100,000 Monopoly dollars and move to any square within the board. Except for free parking. You'll be traveling around the board forever and ever. Anyway, Hasbro in 2015 released the Jackpot edition of Monopoly. And even though the design of this board is completely different to the classic version of Monopoly, and it's hard to get those two mixed up, it does have a rule that money can be placed on free parking, and if you land there, you get any cash that happens to be there at that particular time. So once again, another use of free parking. This year, that's 2018, Hasbro released the Cheetahs edition of Monopoly. And once again, they have an alternative use for free parking. You can land there and just stay there as the classic rules state, or you can take a chance or community chest card and carry out the instructions on those cards. Okay, let's just quickly talk about the electronic era of Monopoly. In 1982, Parker Brothers released the Playmaster, and as you can see, that's an electronic device that you placed in the middle of the board. Parker Brothers claimed that this would speed up the game. There was one major change in the rules, and that's a thing or a feature they called buybacks. If you owned a Monopoly, that's an entire color group, you were able to take out a loan on all those properties. However, the device itself would determine when you had to pay the loan back. And if you didn't have enough cash or assets to pay off that loan, your entire Monopoly would be handed back to the bank for auction. In 2009, Revolution was released. As you can see, this is a major change to the board. The electronic device itself had one feature, and that was the forcing of deals. The game itself had no community chest or chance cards, but it did have 4 zones. And if you landed on one of those zones, you're forced to make a deal depending on the availability of properties. There are several versions of electronic banking. I have 3, and they are dated 2007, 2011, and 2013. The rules in these electronic versions pretty much mirror the classic rules, and the only real difference is the use of credit cards instead of cash. In 2016, Hasbro came out with Ultimate Banking. This game is also aided by an electronic device, but there are major differences in the rules. You don't have to own a monopoly to build houses. In fact, every time you purchase a property, you place one house on that square as shown. Based on the amount of people that land on your property, your rents will go up. Each time a player lands on a property and pays your rent, you move your house up 1 square. There are no hotels, no railroads or utilities. There are location spaces, and if you land on one of those spaces, you pay 100, and you can move anywhere on the board. There's no trading. You cannot collect rent when you are in jail, and the winner is determined once the first person is bankrupt and the remaining players add up their assets. I spoke about the privileges that you can have when you're in jail during our first part of this conversation. Just let you know that a couple of other games, the Here and Now game, you cannot collect rents if you're in jail. And also the Empire version of Monopoly, you cannot collect rent when you're in jail. If you haven't listened to the first part of this discussion, we do go into the privileges that you do have or may not have when playing a classic game of Monopoly, so take a look at that. I'm not going to talk about the short rules as it relates to Monopoly, but I do want to touch base on the speed die. Somewhere around about 2013, once again, don't hold me to these dates, I'm just looking at the dates on the rules that I'm holding here. Anyways, but somewhere around about 2013, Mega Monopoly was released. That was by Winning Moves, but licensed by Hasbro, and they introduced the speed die. And then the speed die was also introduced to the classic game of Monopoly. However, there are differences, even though the die are the same. There is differences in the actual rules between the two games themselves. As shown on the speed die, Mr. Monopoly occupies 2 sides, and the bus occupies 1 side. So let's just look at the quick differences between Mega Monopoly and Classic Monopoly as it relates to the speed die. First of all, in Classic Monopoly, you're required to go around the board once before you introduce the speed die. With Mega Monopoly, you use a speed die from the very beginning. The second difference is the use of the bus. If you roll the bus in Classic Monopoly, well, let's say you roll a 4, a 5, then the bus. You have the choice of moving your token 4 spaces or 5 spaces, or add 2 white die together and move 9 spaces. In Mega Monopoly, you have bus tickets. So if you roll the bus, then you pick up a bus ticket and carry out the rules on the bus ticket. If you decide not to pick up a bus ticket, you do have an alternative, and that's to move to the nearest chance or community chest space and carry out the rules on those cards. So in summarizing the first part and this part, it's evident that Hasbro and Parker Brothers have changed the rules of the fundamental game of Monopoly, which may have led to the use of house rules. I'll let you decide. I'd love to hear your comments. In fact, in around about 2014, Hasbro introduced house rules to its classic game of Monopoly. As you see here, there are 6 cards, and you can decide which rules you want to incorporate into your game. I'm not sure if this is a wise move, as Hasbro and Parker Brothers for the last 80 years have been telling you not to use house rules, because they just lengthen the game. In addition to the changes that we spoke about in part 1 and here in part 2, there are variations of Monopoly, which I believe could lead to the use of house rules. We spoke about Mega Monopoly being released in 2006. In addition to the speed die, that has additional properties. You can also buy depots for railroads, even if you own just one railroad. They introduced skyscrapers in addition to hotels. 2009, there was City Monopoly. You actually build blocks rather than build streets, and the rents may go up and down based on what buildings you actually have within your block. 2012 was the Millionaires edition of Monopoly, and the way to win that game is the first one to reach $1 million. In 2015, there was Jackpot Monopoly, and that game ends when all the money's gone. There's a pile of money that's put by the side of the board. Once that's all used up, the game ends and the one with the highest assets wins. In 2017, Hasbro introduced Here and Now. That was actually a concept of traveling around the world and filling up a passport every time you landed on a country. And the first one to fill up the passport wins. In fact, you cannot go bankrupt in that particular game of Here and Now. 2017, Hasbro introduced the Empire edition of Monopoly. That was actually a concept of buying commodities rather than properties, and you added your commodity to what they refer to as a tower, and the first one to fill a tower is the winner. I don't think 2018 has been a great year for Hasbro. They introduced a Cheaters edition of Monopoly, and that was allowing players to cheat. And if you got away with cheating, you get rewards. But if you got caught cheating, there were penalties. And there were additional other rules that they incorporated in that particular game. The second release this year was the Millennial Edition. I don't think that's going to incorporate any house rules. In fact, the game has no houses, it has no hotels, and no properties. It really is completely different to the classic game of Monopoly. You actually earn credits or experience credits, I guess, as the game goes on, and the one with the most experience credits wins. As I say, I don't think it's been a great year for Hasbro, but that's just my opinion. I think my point here is all these variations of the games that we just spoke about fall under, for a casual player, they fall under Monopoly. All these games are just Monopoly games to the casual player. And that's why I believe that house rules or variations of the rules get transferred from one game to another game. And as I say, with Hasbro and Parker Brothers changing the rules themselves, I believe that they've kind of just made things worse as far as house rules are concerned. Anyway, let me know what you think. I do appreciate you hanging in there. This one's been a little bit longer than normal. So cheers, have a great day, and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.